After the Civil War, the defeated Confederates couldn't accept the verdict.
First of all, it was a very good speech that President Biden gave. I encourage you to watch it in full. And secondly, the American Civil War was actually about states' rights. But it was also about slavery. It was about the states' rights to have slaves. It was about the states' rights to have a slave economy. And the reason for this is there was a fear by the southern plantation owners that if Abraham Lincoln became president, then he would eventually be pressured into abolishing slaves. And the reason for this is because of the tensions in the Western Territories, with the Bleeding Kansas, and then with the execution of John Brown, the martyr for the cause. And there was a deep anti-slavery sentiment brewing in the country. But the reason for this was not inherently humanitarian or not inherently abolitionist in nature, were not inherently against slavery just for being against slavery. In fact, abolition was a fringe concept for the time. Only radicals like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, John Brown supported abolition. The majority of people were in favor of slavery, but the issue came from the Western Territories, as was taught in school. But what we're taught, it's more of a political reason. It's very vague. We're not taught the reasons why the Western Territories played such a crucial role. And yes, there were political aspects to it as well for representation in Congress. But it was mainly economic, because it came down to an agrarian society and the growing industrial society. The northern capitalists wanted to expand to the Western Territories, expand their capital, expand their factories to the Western Territories for further growth. But at the same time, if they did so, then that would mean the plantation owners couldn't expand their territories to the Western Territories as well, because you can't have an industrial society as well as an agrarian society. I mean, where's the land going to come from? So this was the source of the conflict between the slave economy and the industrial economy was the backdrop, was the fuel on the fire. It was inherently economic rather than humanitarian. That's the sad reality of the nature. I mean, it wasn't until after the abolition actually occurred. I mean, after the Civil War and it became clear that abolition was only a way to save the Union. That was the only reason why abolition happened. If it wasn't for the Civil War, slavery wouldn't have been abolished. I mean, it was no possible path for slavery to be abolished peacefully. With all this talk that the Republican Party was a progressive liberal party and the Republicans love to brag about being the party of Lincoln, the reason why they were called radical Republicans is because the abolitionists in the Republican Party were a very small portion of the faction of the party, a very small portion of the party. That's why they were called radical. Because the idea of abolition was a radical concept for humanitarian purposes. I mean, the moderate Republicans were the mainstream Republicans, like Abraham Lincoln. He just wanted to protect industrialization, northern capital, and wanted to allow northern capital to expand freely, free trade, the free market, so to speak. And slave owners posed a threat to that expansion. This was the backdrop of the Republican Party. The Republican Party emerged from the failure of the Whig Party, which were inherent with the support for states' rights. The only foundation of the Whig Party, the only reason the Whig Party existed was to represent states' rights for the entire Union. That included southern states. So the Republican Party was born out of a need to represent states' rights for capitalism, not just for slave owners, but for capitalism, for capital interests, for northern industrialization. States' rights manifested into the states' rights to protect capital, to protect the free market. This was the evolution of conservatism. So the Republican Party was always the conservative party. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, was older. It stemmed from Andrew Jackson, the idea of Jacksonian democracy, which Andrew Jackson was originally a poor white, came from a poor white family, and then earned his money by becoming a slave owner himself, and then a politician, a military man, etc. You can see how Andrew Jackson was able to obtain his success. But he was also obviously sympathetic to the poor white plight because he was himself. I mean, that was his background. And as a result, he supported universal male suffrage, so poor whites such as himself could have representation in government and hopefully be able to compete with the wealthy white peers. This was why Andrew Jackson founded the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, even back then, was a liberal party, or the progressive party for the time's sake. So this idea of a political realignment, it's only based on what we see. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party was really always the same. Was really always the liberal and conservative party. It wasn't really a switch. It's the evolution of the times, the evolution of American history.